He thought he could safely steal a bag from an elderly woman on the subway because there were only indifferent passengers around. But he didn't know who was sitting next to him. One person wouldn't just watch. What happened next surprised everyone. Subscribe and tell us where you're watching us from. The subway car rumbled forward, its wheels clanking against the metal tracks in a steady rhythm. The fluorescent lights overhead flickered occasionally, casting brief shadows along the scratched windows and worn-out plastic seats. The air was thick with the scent of metal, old upholstery, and the faint traces of coffee and fast food that passengers had carried in earlier. It was the unmistakable atmosphere of the city's underground, where the tired, the distracted, and the indifferent sat side by side, each lost in their own world. Chuck Norris sat quietly in a corner seat near the end of the car, his broad shoulders relaxed but his posture perfectly straight. He wore a black button-up shirt, worn jeans, and his signature cowboy hat pulled slightly forward over his eyes. A newspaper was unfolded in his hands, the pages shifting slightly with the movement of the train. His expression was calm, his movements unhurried, as if nothing in the world could disturb his focus. No one in the car paid him any attention. To them, he was just another commuter, another stranger in the anonymous flow of the city. Most people were too wrapped up in their own routines to notice the legendary martial artist and action star sitting among them. A few passengers might have glanced his way, perhaps noting the cowboy hat or the quiet confidence he carried, but none recognized him. And if they did, they kept it to themselves. The subway was nearly full. Office workers in stiff suits sat with their briefcases on their laps, checking their watches as they scrolled through their phones. A teenage girl sat with her headphones in, chewing gum absent-mindedly as she tapped out a message on her screen. A middle-aged man in glasses was engrossed in the stock market section of his newspaper, his brow furrowed in concentration. Near the far end of the car, a young couple whispered to each other, exchanging amused glances over something on their phone. The train jerked slightly as it approached the next station, the metal brakes screeching as they engaged. A robotic voice crackled over the intercom, announcing the stop in a monotone voice. Passengers barely reacted, some shifting in their seats, others barely glancing up from their devices. The doors slid open with a mechanical hiss, and a few people stepped off, disappearing into the underground platform. A moment later, a new wave of passengers entered. Among them was an elderly woman, dark-skinned, her silver hair neatly pulled back into a bun. She carried a large fabric bag, the kind used for carrying groceries or heavy personal belongings. The weight of it made her movements slow and careful as she stepped onto the train. She paused just past the doorway, her eyes scanning the rows of seats, looking for an empty spot. Her face held quiet dignity, but there was a hint of expectation in her gaze, an unspoken hope that someone might notice her burden and offer her a place to sit. No one did. The businessman in his suit glanced at her briefly, then promptly lifted his newspaper higher, pretending to be deeply engrossed in the words on the page. The teenage girl with headphones never even looked up. A man in a hoodie at the back of the car shifted slightly, making himself more comfortable in his seat, his eyes deliberately avoiding hers. She took another step forward, still scanning, but no one moved. The only available seats were too far to reach easily without navigating through the standing passengers. With a quiet sigh, she adjusted the strap of her bag on her shoulder and settled near one of the metal poles, gripping it tightly for support. Chuck Norris noticed everything. He saw the silent rejection in the way the passengers averted their eyes. He saw the subtle shift in her expression, the flicker of disappointment, quickly hidden behind years of experience. This was not the first time she had been ignored. He considered standing up. He had been raised to respect elders, to offer his seat without a second thought. But something made him pause. The train doors slid shut, and with a sudden lurch, the subway car was in motion again. Chuck kept his eyes on the newspaper, but his attention was elsewhere. He was aware of the people around him, of the subtle energy shifts in the car. Years of training, both in martial arts and in life, had made him highly attuned to his surroundings. And then he noticed him. Near the middle of the car, not far from where the elderly woman stood, a young man had taken a seat. He wore a dark hoodie with the hood pulled up over his head, his face partially obscured by shadows. His posture was relaxed, but there was a tension in his movements, a restless energy that didn't match the quiet stillness of the other passengers. His eyes moved, scanning the train. Chuck had seen that kind of look before. It was a look of someone searching for an opportunity. The young man's gaze settled on the elderly woman. His eyes flickered to her bag, then to the people around them. He was calculating, measuring risk. Chuck turned a page in his newspaper, but his focus sharpened. The train rattled forward, the fluorescent lights humming softly overhead. Conversations remained low, the usual murmur of a city train. But in the middle of the car, something was about to change. The young man shifted slightly in his seat, his fingers twitching. His body language said everything. He was getting ready to make his move. The subway car rocked gently as it sped forward through the tunnel, the rhythmic clatter of the wheels echoing through the metal walls. The passengers remained as they were, immersed in their own distractions, barely acknowledging each other. Conversations were whispered, music played through headphones, and the occasional rustle of a turning newspaper page cut through the dull hum of the underground. The atmosphere was indifferent, detached, just another ride in the city's endless routine. Chuck Norris sat motionless, still holding his newspaper, his expression unchanged. He had not shifted, had not given any outward sign of paying attention to anything beyond the printed words on the page. Yet, he saw everything. He noticed the way the young man in the dark hoodie kept glancing around the train, how his fingers twitched slightly against his knee. He watched as the young man's gaze returned again and again to the elderly woman standing near the pole, her heavy bag hanging from her shoulder. The weight of the bag made her stance slightly uneven. She adjusted her grip on the metal pole every few moments, shifting her footing to stay steady as the train swayed. Her face remained composed, but the subtle strain in her arms showed that she was struggling more than she let on. Her large bag rested heavily against her side, filled with whatever belongings she had chosen to carry with her that day. Chuck had spent a lifetime reading people, knowing when someone was preparing to act before they even realized it themselves. He had seen this scenario unfold before in different places, in different ways, but always with the same intention. The young man wasn't just an impatient commuter or someone restless from the long ride. He was a predator looking for an easy target. The young man glanced toward the train doors as the station indicator above the aisle flickered, showing the next stop approaching. His eyes darted to the passengers, scanning them one last time. He was calculating risk, ensuring no one was watching too closely. No one would stop him. He saw only passive observers, people lost in their own lives, unwilling to interfere. Chuck remained still, giving no indication that he was watching. His posture stayed relaxed, his grip on the newspaper steady, as if he had no concern for the movements around him. But beneath the surface, his senses were heightened, every detail feeding into his awareness. He had spent too many years honing his instincts to ignore the feeling that danger was about to strike. The subway jolted slightly as it prepared to stop. In that split second, the young man moved. His hand shot out, fingers clamping onto the strap of the elderly woman's bag. He yanked hard, wrenching it from her grasp with the practiced ease. The force of the movement pulled her off balance, causing her to stumble. She gasped, her hand slipping from the metal pole as she tried to steady herself. Her legs buckled slightly, and she collapsed onto the nearest seat, her elbow striking against the hard plastic surface. The bag was now in the young man's hands. He gripped it tightly, the fabric stretching as he twisted it in his fingers, securing his hold. He smirked slightly, a flicker of satisfaction crossing his face. For a moment, there was silence. Passengers turned their heads briefly, eyes widening in surprise, but no one moved. The businessman lowered his newspaper an inch, then quickly raised it again, pretending he had seen nothing. The teenage girl with headphones hesitated, her fingers hovering over her phone as if considering recording the event, but she quickly looked away. A couple in the corner exchanged nervous glances, but remained frozen in place. No one did anything. The young man, emboldened by the lack of reaction, straightened his shoulders and adjusted his grip on the stolen bag. He turned slightly, preparing to step toward the exit, confident that he could disappear the moment the train reached the next station. He thought he had won. He thought no one would challenge him. He did not see the man sitting near the end of the car, the one who had been holding the newspaper just moments before. Chuck Norris lowered the paper, folding it carefully and placing it beside him on the seat. He exhaled slowly, not out of frustration, not out of anger, but as if he had been waiting for this moment with the quiet patience of someone who had seen too much of the world to be surprised anymore. Then, without a word, he stood up. The subway car swayed slightly as it continued its journey through the underground tunnel, but inside, time seemed to slow. The young man stood near the door, the stolen bag clutched tightly in his grip, his body tensed as he prepared to make his escape at the next station. The passengers remained frozen, their gazes flickering toward him before darting away again. Some looked down at their laps, feigning deep interest in their phones or newspapers, unwilling to get involved. Others stared blankly ahead, pretending nothing had happened at all. The tension in the air was thick, almost suffocating. The elderly woman was still seated where she had fallen. Her hand rested against her elbow where it had struck the hard plastic of the seat, but she made no attempt to speak. Her eyes, dark with shock and something deeper, disappointment perhaps, remained fixed on the bag that had been taken from her. She had seen this before. She had learned over time that people rarely did anything when faced with moments like this. Chuck Norris had seen it too. His newspaper, once an idle distraction, now rested neatly folded on the seat beside him. He took his time as he stood, his movements slow, deliberate, unhurried. The leather of his belt creaked slightly as he shifted, his well-worn boots planting firmly on the subway floor. His hands remained at his sides, relaxed but ready. His cowboy hat tilted slightly forward, casting a shadow over his eyes. The young man holding the stolen bag hadn't noticed him yet. He was still too caught up in his own confidence, in the rush of adrenaline that came with taking something and getting away with it. He adjusted his grip on the bag, his fingers curling tighter around the straps, and shifted his weight toward the door, waiting for the moment they would slide open. But something in the air changed. A subtle shift, something unspoken but undeniable. The silence in the train car took on a new weight. It wasn't the silence of fear anymore. It was something else. The young man sensed it before he saw it. His smirk faltered slightly, a flicker of uncertainty crossing his face. Slowly, cautiously, he turned his head. And then he saw him. Chuck Norris stood a few feet away, still motionless, his stance steady as if he had always been meant to be there. His gaze was unreadable, calm, but unwavering. He did not move toward the young man. He did not speak. He simply stood there, watching. The thief's fingers twitched slightly against the fabric of the bag. His confidence, so strong just moments ago, wavered under the weight of the presence before him. He was used to people looking away, to fear and avoidance. He had counted on it. But this was different. Chuck Norris didn't look afraid. He didn't look angry. He simply looked certain. The young man shifted uncomfortably. He glanced around, searching the faces of the other passengers for reassurance, for support. But none of them met his gaze. They were all looking at Chuck now. The subway rumbled forward, its wheels grinding against the tracks. The station was approaching. The exit was right there. The young man swallowed, forcing his smirk back onto his face, trying to reclaim the control that had slipped through his fingers. "Whatever, old man," he muttered under his breath, more to himself than to Chuck. Then he took a step back. Chuck didn't move. Another step. Chuck's gaze didn't waver. The young man's breathing quickened slightly. He was used to fights, verbal, physical, whatever the situation demanded. But this wasn't a fight. This was something else. This was a force he didn't understand, something beyond intimidation, beyond posturing. This was inevitability. And then, without another word, the young man loosened his grip on the bag. The straps slipped from his fingers, the weight of it falling back to the floor. It landed with a quiet thud. He hesitated for a brief moment longer, as if considering some final act of defiance. But then the train's brakes engaged, the doors slid open, and the decision was made for him. Without looking back, he stepped out onto the platform and disappeared into the crowd. The tension in the subway car held for another moment before it finally broke. The passengers exhaled, shifting slightly in their seats as if wakened from a trance. The businessman who had hidden behind his newspaper lowered it slightly, his gaze flickering toward Chuck before quickly looking away. The teenage girl clutched her phone in both hands, her eyes wide. Chuck didn't react. He bent down, picked up the elderly woman's bag, and held it out to her. She hesitated, then took it from him, her fingers wrapping tightly around the straps once more. She met his gaze, and for the first time since the moment she had stepped onto the train, she smiled. Chuck gave her a small nod, then sat back down. He picked up his newspaper, unfolded it, and resumed reading. The subway doors slid shut, and the train rumbled forward, carrying them all into the city's endless motion. The subway car moved forward with a steady hum, the lights overhead flickering slightly as the train rocked along the tracks. The tension that had filled the space moments ago had not yet fully dissipated. The air felt heavier, the kind of weight that lingers after something important has happened. Passengers shifted in their seats, glancing at each other, some still avoiding eye contact altogether. The young man who had attempted to steal the elderly woman's bag was gone, but the impact of his presence, and more importantly, of his exit, remained. The elderly woman clutched her bag tightly in her lap now, her fingers wrapped around the worn straps as though afraid to let go. She had not said a word since Chuck Norris had handed it back to her. She sat with her back straight, her face composed, but there was something in her eyes, something unspoken. Chuck Norris remained in his seat, holding his newspaper once more, but this time he was not reading it. The pages remained open in front of him, but his eyes were still. He was listening, feeling the shift in the room around him as he had done so many times before. Across the car, the businessman who had previously hidden behind his newspaper now sat rigidly, his fingers gripping the edge of the paper as though debating whether to turn the page or simply put it down. He had witnessed everything, but he had done nothing. The teenage girl who had been staring at her phone still held it in her hands, but she was no longer typing or scrolling. She was looking at Chuck, then at the elderly woman, then back at the floor, processing what she had seen. There was something different about the silence now. Before, it had been the silence of hesitation, of avoidance, of people pretending not to see what was happening right in front of them. Now it was the silence of recognition. Chuck had seen it before. He knew this kind of moment. It was the kind that forced people to confront themselves in a way they hadn't expected. The kind that made them think about their own choices, about what they would have done if the situation had played out differently. The businessman, the teenager, the other passengers, they weren't bad people. They had simply done what most people did when faced with confrontation. Nothing. But now, that nothing felt like something. The elderly woman adjusted the strap of her bag and let out a quiet breath. It was almost imperceptible, but Chuck noticed. She was still holding on to what had happened. Not just the physical weight of the bag, but the moment itself, the reality of what could have been. She had lived long enough to know that this was not an isolated incident, that moments like these happened all the time, in different places to different people. And she had lived long enough to know that most of the time no one stood up. Chuck folded his newspaper, setting it down beside him. He turned his head slightly, just enough to meet the woman's eyes. She looked at him, really looked at him, for the first time since the encounter. There was gratitude there, of course, but also understanding. No words were exchanged. None were needed. The train rumbled forward, the wheels grinding against the tracks, carrying them all further into the city. The passengers slowly returned to their own worlds, but the air still felt different. The businessman finally turned the page of his newspaper, but his hands were tense, his mind clearly elsewhere. The teenage girl glanced at Chuck one last time before looking down at her phone, though she did not resume typing. Chuck shifted slightly in his seat, tilting his cowboy hat forward just a fraction, settling back into the rhythm of the train. The city moved around them, unchanged. But inside this subway car, something had shifted. The subway continued its journey through the underground, the rhythmic clatter of the tracks filling the space with a steady hum. The tension that had once gripped the passengers had loosened, but it had not disappeared completely. It lingered in the way people sat, in the way they stole glances at Chuck Norris and the elderly woman, in the way their hands fidgeted against their laps or gripped their belongings just a little tighter. The elderly woman adjusted the bag on her lap, her fingers no longer trembling, but still wrapped firmly around the straps. She was no longer afraid. She was no longer bracing herself for another attack. Instead, she simply held on, steady now, as though anchoring herself in the aftermath of what had just taken place. The man in the business suit sat stiffly, his newspaper still open in front of him, though he had long since stopped reading. His eyes flicked toward Chuck every few moments, as if trying to process what he had witnessed. The teenage girl, still holding her phone, had turned off the screen, staring down at it as if deep in thought. Even the couple in the far corner, who had been whispering and giggling earlier, were quieter now, their expressions more subdued. Everyone had seen what had happened. Everyone had felt it. Chuck sat back in his seat, his expression unchanged, his body as still and composed as ever. He was used to this kind of moment, the quiet after something significant, the way people processed what they had seen, what they had chosen to do, or not to do. It wasn't about judgment. He didn't expect them to have acted. He knew the world. He knew how it worked. People didn't intervene because they were bad. They didn't intervene because they were afraid. Afraid of stepping in, of becoming involved, of putting themselves in harm's way. That fear had ruled the subway car until a single movement had broken it. A simple act of standing up had changed everything. No words had been spoken. No violence had been needed. Just the presence of someone willing to be different. The elderly woman finally exhaled, her shoulders relaxing slightly as she turned to Chuck. She didn't say anything at first. She simply looked at him as if searching for the right words. Then, slowly, she nodded. "Thank you." Chuck returned the nod. Nothing more needed to be said. The subway began to slow as it approached the next station, the brakes hissing as the train prepared to stop. The passengers stirred slightly, shifting in their seats, some reaching for their bags. The businessman folded his newspaper but did not get up. The teenage girl pressed the power button on her phone but didn't look at the screen. The elderly woman adjusted her bag once more and prepared to rise. Chuck stood before she did, stepping to the side, clearing the way for her without making a show of it. She hesitated only for a moment before pushing herself up from the seat. She gave him one last look, another nod of understanding, then turned toward the doors. The subway doors slid open with a metallic hiss, and she stepped out onto the platform, disappearing into the flow of the city. For a moment, Chuck remained standing. The train car was quieter now. The tension had drained away, replaced with something else. Awareness, maybe. A quiet realization among the passengers that they had just witnessed something they wouldn't soon forget. He sat back down. The subway doors closed. The train lurched forward once more, carrying its passengers deeper into the heart of the city. Chuck reached for his newspaper, unfolded it, and resumed reading. The world had moved on, but everyone in that car knew that for at least one moment it had been different. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more like it. Check out our other videos for more powerful stories and share this one with others. It's a story worth spreading.